September 18th, 1989. Canton Township, Michigan. The morning light spilled gently across the quiet streets, glinting off mailboxes and maple leaves just beginning to blush red with fall. A cool breeze carried that crisp edge of early autumn, and for a while, everything felt normal. The hum of school buses, the sound of sprinklers, the faint smell of coffee drifting from open kitchen windows. Inside a modest two-story home on the outskirts of an arbor, the Wivell family was starting another ordinary day. Franklin Wivell sat at the table with his newspaper, the steady drip of the percolator beside him. His wife, Eleanor, was buttering toast with her usual precision, while upstairs, their grandson Dale, lanky, 13, hair always a mess, was fighting his alarm clock with teenage determination. And then there was Beverly, 31 years old, brown hair tied back in a neat ponytail. A woman with a quiet strength in her eyes, the kind that comes from holding yourself together when life doesn't make it easy. She'd been through hell the past few years, a bitter divorce, financial strain, and a lonely process of trying to rebuild from nothing. Her ex-husband, Jeremy Thorne, was volatile, always quick to anger, and the divorce had drained more than her savings. It had taken pieces of her peace, her sleep, her confidence. Still, Beverly tried. For Dale, he was her anchor, her reason. After the divorce, he'd moved in with Franklin and Eleanor. Stability for him, they all said. But deep down, Beverly felt the sting every night she drove back to her small, half-furnished apartment in Canton. Sometimes she stayed with her boyfriend, Carl Henderson, a truck driver who came and went with the road. Sometimes she crashed at friends' places. And on nights when things got complicated, when her parents disapproved of Carl, or when she couldn't stand the silence of her apartment, she slept in her car. It wasn't the life she wanted, but it was the life she was trying to fix. That morning, she'd stayed at her parents' house. She wanted to make sure Dale got to school on time. Morning, sleepyhead, she teased as he stumbled down the stairs, rubbing his eyes. 5 more minutes, he grumbled, snatching a piece of toast from the counter. Beverly smiled, that small, tired smile of a mother who carries both love and guilt in the same breath. No can do, big guy. Let's go. You got school, and I've got a job lead to chase. Her father folded the newspaper, giving her a look that was half pride, half worry. Everything ready, Bev? All set, Dad, she said with a quick pat on his shoulder. Eleanor, ever the worrier, stepped from the pantry. Call me later, won't you, dear? Beverly hugged her tightly. Of course, Mom. Wish me luck at the library. At 8:30 a.m., her old blue Ford Fairmont, with its fading white vinyl top, rolled out of the driveway. The car coughed once, then settled into its familiar hum. Dale sat in the passenger seat, backpack at his feet, lost in thought. The drive to Canton Middle School was short. They talked about homework, weekend plans, small things that wouldn't matter, until they suddenly would. Beverly pulled up to the curb, leaned over, and kissed the top of her son's head. All right, sport. Have a great day. Yeah, you too, Mom. He paused, hesitated, then hugged her. Quick, awkward, but real. Love you. Love you more, she whispered back. He slammed the door shut and disappeared into the flow of students. Beverly watched him until he vanished inside the building, then took a deep breath and pulled away from the curb. Her next stop was the library, a job inquiry she'd been hopeful about, but there was time to spare. So she drove a few quiet streets over, into a more secluded stretch of Canton Township. She parked along a side road near Ford and Gotfredson, cracked the window open, and rested her head back. For a few brief moments, it was peaceful. The hum of insects, the rustle of dry grass, the world turning quietly around her. Then, sometime around 9 a.m., that peace was shattered. Roy Miller, a burly construction worker, was driving to a job site nearby when he heard it. 2 sharp cracks that cut to the morning air. Gunshots. He slammed the brakes, eyes darting toward the noise. And from behind a patch of overgrown brush, he saw movement. A blue car with a white top speeding away, tires spitting gravel as it vanished down the road. He didn't stop. Not then. Maybe he thought it was hunters, maybe kids. But something about it felt wrong. The image of that car, that flash of blue and white, would stay with him for decades. Minutes later, a patrol car rolled onto the scene, its siren off but lights flashing in the distance. Officer David Jenkins stepped out, scanning the roadside. Nothing at first, just a faint hum of traffic, the whisper of wind through tall grass. And then he saw her, partially hidden in the weeds, motionless, a woman, face down, her shoes scuffed, her clothes dirt-stained. He called it in immediately. Within the hour, the intersection of Ford and Gotfredson was swarming with police. Yellow tape fluttered in the wind. Reporters began to circle. And under the thin morning sun, Detective Casey Luke knelt beside the body, studying the scene in silence. Something was off. The ground wasn't soaked the way it should have been. There wasn't enough blood for a gunshot wound like that. She wasn't killed here, he muttered. She was moved. The realization settled like ice in his chest. Whoever did this hadn't acted out of rage or impulse. They planned it, controlled it, left just enough to confuse. By noon, Canton Township, a town that once felt untouched by violence, was blanketed with fear. Patrol cars idled at every intersection. Neighbors whispered across driveways. Parents clutched their children a little tighter. And for Franklin and Eleanor Wivell, their world had already begun to collapse, though they didn't yet know it. The woman in the grass was Beverly, a daughter, a mother, gone in an instant. That peaceful September morning had been shattered forever. And the mystery behind her death, a life stolen, a predator unseen, was only beginning. The news of the body spread quickly through Canton Township. By mid-morning, the story had already rippled through police radios, classrooms, and kitchen tables. A woman found dead near Ford and Gotfredson. No witnesses. No suspect. Detective Casey Luke had seen enough in his 20 years on the force to know when something didn't add up. And this one didn't. The way the grass was pressed. The absence of blood. The faint drag marks near the shoulder of the road. It all spoke of calculation, not chaos. Someone had killed her somewhere else, then brought her here. He crouched beside the body as the forensic team worked in silence, gloved hands brushing away bits of soil and broken weeds. The victim's shoes were scuffed, her blouse torn, but there was a stillness to her face, as if death had arrived before she even had time to fight. Luke exhaled slowly, eyes narrowing. This wasn't random, he said quietly. Somebody knew her. By noon, the area had become a hive of flashing lights and murmured voices. Yellow tape stretched across the road. Local reporters hovered near the perimeter, cameras ready. For the first time in years, the peaceful suburban calm of Canton Township felt fragile, breakable. And then, a few hours later, another call came in. A patrol car had found something. Less than 3 miles away, in the wooded edge of Griffin Park, a blue Ford Fairmont sat idling. Engine running, driver's door wide open. A woman's purse lay neatly on the front seat. Inside were cash, ID, lipstick. Nothing stolen. It was Beverly's car. The same vehicle witnesses had seen speeding away just after the gunshots. Detectives Luke and Serena Albright arrived minutes later, the air thick with the smell of exhaust and the buzz of insects. The car looked untouched, too untouched. The radio still hummed faintly, static from a lost frequency. Luke stood beside the open door, eyes tracing the details. The position of the seatbelt, the way the purse sat perfectly upright, the faint imprint of a hand on the steering wheel. She didn't leave this car willingly, he said, almost to himself. Inside the trunk, there was nothing. No signs of struggle, no blood, no fingerprints that weren't hers. But Beverly's body, found miles away, told a darker story. The autopsy confirmed what everyone feared. Beverly Wivell had been sexually assaulted and shot twice, once in the chest and once in the mouth. A brutal, deliberate act. Not just murder, but silencing. The discovery sent ripples through the small Michigan community. The Canton Chronicle ran her photo on the front page. Young mother found dead. Police seek clues. Her eyes, soft and kind in the image, seemed to stare right back from every gas station counter and grocery store bulletin board. Neighbors locked their doors for the first time. Parents refused to let kids walk home alone. The sense of safety that once defined suburban life was replaced by quiet dread. Back at the sheriff's office, the case board filled quickly, names, times, maps, a network of lines linking dead ends to new possibilities. Detective Luke went over every lead with relentless focus. The first call went to Jeremy Thorne, Beverly's ex-husband, a man with a temper, a man who had, at one time, promised her forever and left her with scars instead. Jeremy showed up at the station angry, defensive, arms crossed over his chest. She was my wife once, yeah, he snapped, but I didn't kill her. You want to know where I was? At work. Ask my boss. His alibi checked out, time card, co-workers, everything. But his attitude kept him on the board. Next was Carl Henderson, Beverly's boyfriend, a truck driver, constantly on the road. He swore he was hauling freight upstate the day she died. We fought sometimes, he admitted, eyes darting away. But she didn't deserve this. His alibi also seemed solid, delivery logs, timestamps. Still, Luke wasn't convinced. Someone, he told his team, knew exactly where she'd be that morning. Alone, in her car, waiting. Days passed, then weeks. Every tip led nowhere. The fingerprints lifted from Beverly's car didn't match anyone in the database. The forensic kit, carefully preserved, contained DNA, but 1989 wasn't ready for that kind of science. They could collect it. They just couldn't use it. Hope started to fade. Then, in January 1990, a call came in, an anonymous tip, a name, Walter Wally Henderson, a cousin of Carl's. Known to police, minor assaults, public drunkenness, the kind of guy who lingered too long around parks. He drove a blue car, with a white top. The lead was too perfect to ignore. On a gray, bitter morning, Luke and Albright knocked on the door of a rundown trailer in Ypsilanti. Wally opened it halfway, eyes glassy, cigarette trembling in his hand. He denied everything, said he'd been out of town, didn't even know Beverly. But his nervousness, the way he kept glancing toward the unmade bed, the scattered beer cans, the way his voice cracked, made the detectives push harder. He was brought in for questioning. Local news got wind of it. For a brief, desperate moment, the community dared to believe the nightmare might finally be ending. But it didn't. Wally's girlfriend Loretta gave him an airtight alibi. Phone records confirmed it. He'd been miles away that morning, playing bingo at a church hall. The evidence didn't match. The DNA didn't match. And so, after 2 days, he walked free. The headlines that once screamed, "Arrest and Wivell murder," turned into quieter, sadder columns of disappointment. And for Franklin and Eleanor Wivell, the hope that had flickered for the first time since that September morning went dark again. Their living room, once filled with the smell of coffee and laughter, now felt like a mausoleum. Eleanor sat by the window every day, staring out the rose bush Beverly had planted years ago. Franklin, stoic as ever, tried to be strong for his grandson, but the weight of it all pressed down harder with each season that passed. For Detective Luke, the case became a ghost that refused to rest. He kept the file on his desk long after it was labeled cold. He'd open it sometimes, tracing his fingers over the faded photos, the crime scene, the car, Beverly's smile, wondering what he'd missed. Winter turned to spring, spring to years, and the world moved on. But somewhere, the man who had taken Beverly's life kept living too, walking through grocery aisles, pumping gas, blending in. And no one, not even the people who'd once feared him, would have guessed how close he'd always been. The case of Beverly Wivell had gone cold. But the silence of that morning, those 2 gunshots, still lingered in Canton Township, like an echo that refused to fade. The months after Beverly Wivell's murder turned into years, and the years blurred into decades. For a while, the case still flickered across the evening news. A photo of a smiling woman, a police sketch of a car, a plea for tips. But over time, even that faded. The world kept turning, and the murder of a young mother in Canton Township became one of those stories people stopped talking about. In the Washington County Sheriff's Office, the file sat thick and yellowed on a steel shelf, its edges curling with age. The words possible abduction, homicide, stamped across the front in fading ink. Detective Casey Luke had moved on to other cases, but he could never quite leave this one behind. Sometimes on slow nights, he'd pull it down, flip to the brittle pages, and stare at Beverly's photo, her soft smile frozen in time, her eyes calm and steady, unaware of what was coming. He'd traced the old evidence forms with fingertip, the tire tracks, the hair fibers, the DNA kit that in 1989 meant nothing. One day, he'd mutter, "Science will catch up," and then he'd close the file again, that same old ache sitting heavy in his chest. Outside the walls of the station, the Wivell family carried their grief like a second skin. Franklin and Eleanor aged under its weight. Their once busy home grew silent. The television left off most days, the air thick with absence. Eleanor would often sit by the kitchen window, staring at the small rose bush Beverly had planted years earlier, its petals red as blood each spring. "She loved those," she'd whisper, voice trembling. Franklin tried to be strong, to be the pillar for his grandson, but the strain of living with an open wound, the kind that never heals, wore him down. Their grandson Dale, now a teenager, barely spoke about his mother. At school, whispers followed him. "That's the kid whose mom was murdered." He hated the pity in their eyes, hated the way adults lowered their voices when he entered a room. So he built a shell around himself, a quiet boy who learned to carry pain in silence. Years turned into milestones. Birthdays came and went. Beverly's name was spoken less and less, because saying it out loud only reopened the wound. The anniversary of her death became a day of silence. No words, no plans, just quiet remembrance. In 2004, Franklin passed away in his sleep. Eleanor followed soon after. Neither lived to see the truth uncovered. At their funeral, Dale stood beside their graves, holding the same framed photo that had been printed in the newspaper years before, his mother's smile, faint and tired but hopeful. He was 28 by then, with a life of his own, a family starting to form. But that morning, standing under the gray Michigan sky, he was still the 13-year-old boy watching his mother drive away. He whispered the same words she'd said that day outside Canton Middle School. "Love you more." The words vanished into the wind. By the time the 2010s arrived, Canton Township had changed. New neighborhoods had sprouted where old fields once were. The roads were smoother, the parks brighter. People moved in, raised families, never knowing the story buried beneath their feet. But every September, for those who remembered, the past flickered like an old scar. A few still placed flowers at the site along Ford Road. Others lit candles at the church vigil, where Beverly's name was read among the unsolved. And Dale, now older, quieter, carrying a kind of tired sadness that never quite leaves, always came. He'd stand at the back, listening to the pastor's words fade into the soft hum of wind through the trees. And he'd think about the blue car, the grass, the 2 gunshots that still echoed in his head after all those years. He didn't expect answers anymore, just peace. But miles away, deep in a police storage facility, the truth waited, sealed in a cold metal drawer. A small vial, carefully labeled in fading ink. Beverly Wivell, 1989 sexual assault kit. Inside it, the killer's DNA, preserved through heat and storms and time itself. For 35 years, it sat in silence, waiting. And in 2024, that silence was finally broken. 35 years. That's how long the case had been cold. The kind of cold that seeps into the bones of everyone it touches. Detectives, families, an entire community. For most people, the Beverly Wivell case was a tragedy frozen in time, tucked away in the dusty corners of Michigan's collective memory. But for Dale Swanson, it was never over. Every birthday, every Christmas, every September 18th, the same ache returned. He'd grown up, married, had children of his own, but the hole his mother left never closed. There were nights he'd wake up from dreams where she was still alive, smiling, driving to school, and for a second he believed it was real. Then the silence came back. It always did. Until one morning, in the spring of 2024, Dale got a call that would change everything. "Mr. Swanson," the voice said, calm but urgent. "This is Chief of Detectives Austin Pearson, Washington County Sheriff's Office. I think we might have something." In the sterile back room of the sheriff's office, Pearson stood surrounded by boxes marked cold case archives. His team had been going through old files, looking for cases that might benefit from modern DNA technology. Beverly's case, dusty, brittle, but meticulously preserved, caught his attention. The evidence log included something most old cases didn't: a complete sexual assault kit from 1989, stored under ideal conditions. Back then, DNA testing was primitive. Now it was revolutionary. Pearson reached out to Othram Laboratories in Texas, one of the most advanced forensic genomics labs in the country, known for turning forgotten crimes into solved ones. Their technique, called forensic genealogy, didn't just match DNA to criminal databases like Cody's. It traced genetic relationships, building family trees to identify suspects who'd otherwise stay hidden. It was a long shot, but Pearson had nothing to lose. The kit was shipped off under heavy chain of custody protocol, sealed and labeled. For weeks, silence. Then one day, an email subject line appeared in Pearson's inbox. Othram report, viable male DNA profile recovered. He opened it slowly, heart pounding. After 35 years, they finally had a complete DNA profile of the man who had raped and murdered Beverly Wivell. The next step was genealogy. Othram's analysts began building out the suspect's ancestral connections, tracing distant cousins, matching shared genetic markers across public databases. Names began appearing. Family trees took shape. And then one branch, one name, stood out: Buster Robbins. Pearson stared at the report in disbelief. He'd never heard the name before. Robbins wasn't in the original investigation. Not a witness, not a suspect. Nothing. Just a ghost. Someone who had slipped through the cracks while the world moved on. A background check revealed more. Buster Robbins was 66 years old. He'd lived quietly in Almont, Michigan, about 90 miles northeast of Canton. Married, no criminal record beyond a few minor citations. Worked steady jobs. Went to church. Even volunteered at community events. But one detail hit like a gut punch. In 1989, the year Beverly was killed, Robbins had served as a reserve officer for the Macomb County Sheriff's Department. He'd worn a badge. He'd been one of them. Pearson's hands trembled as he closed the file. If this was true, if the DNA match held, it meant that for 35 years, a murderer had lived among them, respected, trusted, completely unnoticed. The next challenge was proof. They couldn't arrest him yet. They needed confirmation. A direct modern DNA sample to compare to the 1989 profile. And they had to get it quietly. So, a plan was set in motion. For weeks, detectives watched Robbins' modest home from unmarked cars parked along the street. The man's life was painfully ordinary. Early walks with his wife, trips to the grocery store, mowing the lawn. He had no idea that his every move was being tracked by the same profession he'd once pretended to serve. Then, one crisp afternoon, the opportunity came. Robbins walked to his mailbox, coffee cup in hand. He took a long sip, crumpled the cup, and tossed it into his curbside bin before heading back inside. That was it. Detective Robert Miller, disguised as a utility worker, retrieved it minutes later. The cup was bag-tagged and rushed to the Michigan State Police Forensic Lab. The wait felt endless. Pearson barely slept. Every tick of the clock felt heavier than the last. Then the call came. The technician's voice was shaking with excitement. "Chief, it's a match. A perfect match. The DNA from the cup matches the 1989 sample. Buster Robbins is your guy." Pearson didn't speak for several seconds. He just closed his eyes and let the words sink in. 35 years. 35 years of silence, pain, and unanswered prayers, all shattered by a single discarded coffee cup. On the morning of November 21st, 2024, law enforcement vehicles lined a quiet suburban street in Almont. Neighbors peeked through curtains as officers in tactical gear approached the Robbins residence. Inside, Buster Robbins was making breakfast. He looked up as the knock came. When he opened the door and saw the badges, his face froze. "Mr. Robbins," Pearson said evenly, "we have a warrant for your arrest in connection with the murder of Beverly Wivell." The color drained from Robbins' face. What is this about?" he muttered, voice trembling. No one answered. The handcuffs clicked shut. Inside his home, investigators found exactly what they feared and expected. A .45 caliber magazine and matching ammunition, identical to the weapon used in Beverly's killing. And worse, digital evidence of child exploitation on his computer. The illusion of a quiet, harmless old man shattered instantly. When the news broke, it swept through Michigan like wildfire. Cold case solved after 35 years. Former reserve officer arrested. For the people of Canton Township, it was disbelief first, then fury. He lived right here, one neighbor told reporters. He walked free all these years. But for Dale Swanson, the call from Pearson brought something different, something deeper. He sat in silence. The phone pressed his ear, his heart thundering in his chest. For so long, he'd stopped believing this day would ever come. And now it had. After 35 years, his mother finally had a name, Buster Robbins. The man who'd hidden in plain sight. The man who'd stolen everything. Justice, though delayed, had finally found its way through time. And for the first time since 1989, the silence surrounding Beverly Wivell's death began to break. When the news broke, it hit Michigan like a storm. After 35 years of silence, the Beverly Wivell case was suddenly alive again. Newspapers ran her picture, that same portrait from 1989, beside the mugshot of a man few had ever heard of, Buster Robbins, a husband, a retired volunteer officer, a friendly neighbor who waved at kids riding their bikes. But behind that mask of normalcy lay the face of a predator. The people of Canton Township were stunned. He lived here? All this time, one woman whispered to a local reporter, her voice trembling. He went to our church. It was the same reaction over and over. Disbelief curdled into outrage. For Dale Swanson, the call came quietly late in the evening. He answered on the third ring. Dale, Chief Pearson said softly, "We got him." There was a long silence on the line. Then Dale whispered, "You're sure?" Pearson exhaled. "DNA doesn't lie." Dale didn't speak for several seconds. When he did, his voice was thin, unsteady. "My mom, she finally gets her day." The arrest made headlines across Michigan. November 21st, 2024. Police cars swarmed the neat little neighborhood in Almont. The man who'd once worn a deputy's uniform was led from his home in handcuffs, head down, jaw tight. Reporters shouted questions as flashbulbs burst through the gray morning light. "Did you kill her, Buster? Why did you do it?" He said nothing, just the clink of cuffs and the slow shuffle toward the cruiser. Inside the station, detectives processed him quietly. Fingerprints, mugshots, swabs. Every motion carried the gravity of decades of unfinished business. As officers escorted him down the hall, one of them whispered under his breath, 35 years, and you almost got away with it." At his arraignment, Buster Robbins looked smaller than he'd ever been. The courtroom buzzed with tension. The air felt heavy. He sat at the defense table in a pressed shirt and thick glasses, his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted them. When the judge asked for his plea, his lawyer stood and said the words everyone expected, but still dreaded. "Not guilty, Your Honor." A ripple went through the room. Across the aisle, Dale Swanson sat with his hands folded tight, eyes locked on the man who had stolen his mother's life. He didn't flinch. He didn't look away. He just stared. In the weeks that followed, the defense built its argument. They claimed the DNA didn't prove murder, only contact. They suggested that maybe the encounter had been consensual, that maybe someone else had fired the gun, that maybe after 35 years memory and evidence had blurred. It was a strategy of doubt, a desperate attempt to twist time itself. But the prosecution, led by Washtenaw County prosecutor Eli Savitt, didn't waver. He laid out the facts clearly, methodically, each word striking like a hammer. The DNA from the sexual assault kit, a perfect match. The .45 caliber ammunition found in Robbins' home, identical to the bullets used in 1989. The second gunshot, the one through Beverly's mouth, the unmistakable mark of an execution. This was not love, Savitt told the court. This was control, power, violence. And for 35 years, he's lived free while a child grew up without his mother. Outside the courthouse, cameras and news crews gathered in the freezing Michigan wind. The story spread beyond Canton. National headlines now spoke of the 35-year cold case solved through forensic genealogy. To the public, it was justice through science. But to Dale, it was something far more personal. He sat through every hearing, every motion, every delay. Sometimes, he'd catch Robbins looking at him, that cold, hollow stare, and he'd feel his stomach twist. He wasn't seeing a monster. He was seeing a man who had hidden behind the illusion of normal life for decades. In interviews, Dale's voice stayed calm, but the pain lived underneath every word. "I don't hate him," he said once, staring into the camera. "I just want him to face what he did. For once in his life, I want him to look at what he's taken." The trial loomed, set for early 2026, but the pre-trial hearing stretched endlessly. Legal motions, DNA verifications, witness statements, a mountain of evidence being rebuilt piece by piece after 3.5 decades. When the judge reviewed the file, over 600 pages thick, she set down her glasses and looked over at Robbins. "Given the severity of the charges," she said firmly, "and the strength of the evidence, bail is denied." Robbins would await trial behind bars. That night, Dale stood outside the courthouse in the snow. The lights from the windows glowed behind him, the sound of camera shutters fading as reporters packed up. He looked up at the sky, gray, quiet, endless. For 35 years, his mother's case had been nothing but silence. Now the silence was over. He thought of her voice that last morning, gentle, calm, teasing. "Love you more." It echoed again, softer this time, somewhere in the wind. He smiled through tears, whispering back, "We're almost there, Mom." The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that is weight. It pressed against the walls, against every person in the room, as if 35 years of pain had finally gathered here, waiting to exhale. At the defense table sat Buster Robbins, older now, his one steady hands trembling slightly. His gray hair was combed neatly, his glasses polished, but nothing could hide the cracks. His eyes darted toward the jury, toward the prosecutors, toward the single figure seated in the front row behind them, Dale Swanson. Dale didn't move. He didn't blink. He had waited 3.5 decades for this moment. The prosecution had finished its closing argument. Eli Savitz's voice still echoed faintly in the air. This isn't just about science. It's about a promise that no matter how much time passes, truth does not disappear. Beverly Wivell was a daughter, a mother, and her voice, silenced in 1989, finally speaks today through the DNA she left behind. The jurors filed out. Minutes turned into hours. Dale stared down at his hands, at the worn photograph of his mother he always carried, the one taken the summer before she died. She was smiling, hair tied back, sunlight catching the edge of her face. He remembered her voice, the warmth, the way she said, "Love you more." He had repeated it to himself every day since. When the jury returned, time seemed to stop. The foreman rose, a folded piece of paper in his hands. The judge nodded. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" "Yes, Your Honor, we have." The words came slow, deliberate, final. "We." The jury find the defendant, Buster Robbins, guilty of first-degree murder and criminal sexual conduct. For a moment, no one moved. Then the air broke. Soft gasps, muffled sobs. The creak of benches as people exhaled decades of held breath. Robbins sat motionless, his face blank, eyes dull. It was as if the mask he'd worn for half a lifetime had finally collapsed. Across the room, Dale lowered his head into his hands. He didn't cry. Not right away. It was something deeper. Relief and grief fused together, heavy as stone. Chief Pearson, standing near the back, closed his eyes. He had promised Dale, years ago, that if there was even a 1% chance, he'd chase it. Now, watching the verdict unfold, he whispered under his breath, "We kept our promise, Bev." Outside the courthouse, the world was watching. News crews lined the steps. Microphones, cameras, headlines ready to capture closure in a single word, justice. But for Dale, it didn't feel like closure. Not exactly. It felt like standing at the edge of something vast and quiet, staring into the space where his mother used to be. When reporters asked for comment, he hesitated. Then he said softly, "This isn't about revenge. It's about peace." For years, I just want to know why. Now I realize there's no why that could ever make sense. But at least I can finally say her name and know that people will remember who she was, not just what happened to her. He looked up at the cold Michigan sky, snow falling lightly across the courthouse steps. "She was more than a case file," he said. "She was my mom." Weeks later, Dale visited the cemetery in Ann Arbor. The ground was frozen, the wind sharp, but the sky was clear. He knelt beside the graves of his grandparents, where Beverly's name was etched beside theirs. He placed a single red rose on the stone, the same kind she used to plant in her mother's garden. For a long time, he just sat there, eyes closed, letting the quiet settle. And for the first time in his life, that quiet didn't feel empty. It felt like peace. Across Michigan, the story of Beverly Wivell became something more than tragedy. It became a symbol of endurance, of how love, memory, and truth can outlast time itself. Detectives cited her case as proof that no murder is ever truly forgotten, that somewhere in some cold storage locker or dusty file, answers are waiting to be found. And every fall, when the leaves in Canton Township begin to turn, people still stop by the small roadside near Ford and Gotfredson, the place where her story began. They leave flowers, sometimes a candle, sometimes just silence. The wind moves through the tall grass, and if you stand there long enough, you might almost hear it. The faint echo of a mother's voice carried through time, whispering into the still air, "Love you more."